The auctioneer's gavel came down like a gunshot in the dusty silence of Caldwell, Kansas, and Annie Gentry pressed her last remaining treasure between her fingers and stepped forward into the crowd before she could lose her nerve. It was the autumn of 1878, and the plains of southern Kansas had not been kind that year. The grasshoppers had come through in July, stripping the fields bare in the span of an afternoon, leaving behind nothing but pale, chewed stalks and the hollow silence of ruin. The cattle drives up the Kisham Trail had slowed. The money had dried up along with the creek beds, and every widow from Wichita to the Texas Panhandle knew the particular cold arithmetic of counting what remained and measuring it against what was owed. Annie Gentry was 26 years old, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, with work-roughened hands and a jaw set in the stubborn line that her mother had always called her best feature and her worst habit. She had been widowed 14 months ago when Thomas Gentry had ridden out in a lightning storm to chase a spooked heifer and had never come back. The horse had returned at dawn, reins trailing. Thomas had been found in a gully 2 miles from home, his neck broken from the fall. She had grieved him properly, buried him under the cottonwood at the edge of their claim, and then she had turned around and faced the machinery of what his death had left behind. The mortgage on the farm held by the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell, the unpaid account at Mercer's General Store, the note on the seed loan from the previous spring. The numbers did not soften with grief. They accumulated instead, patient and indifferent, the way interest always does. By the morning of October the 9th, Annie had sold the mule, sold the 2 milk cows, sold the iron stove her mother had sent from Ohio, and still the mortgage payment loomed at the end of the month like a canyon wall she could see but could not climb. She had $62.40 to her name. The bank required $115. She stood in front of the small mirror above her washstand in the room she rented from the widow Hargrove on Cedar Street and looked at her left hand. The wedding ring had been Thomas's grandmother's. A simple gold band set with a small rose-cut diamond, not more than a quarter carat, but the gold was real and the diamond was genuine, and it was the last thing she owned that had any value beyond sentiment. She had worn it for 3 years through good days and hard ones. She had cooked in it and planted in it and nursed Thomas through a fever in it. Taking it off felt like something dying again, but she took it off. The Caldwell auction house operated out of a converted livery stable on Main Street, 2 doors down from the hotel and directly across from the barber shop. Thursday was auction day. By the time Annie arrived, pushing through the wide plank doors with the ring wrapped in a square of cloth in her coat pocket, the place was already thick with the smell of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular anxious energy of people who needed either to sell or to buy. Amos Greer was the auctioneer, a narrow man with a red suspenders habit and a voice that carried to the street. He was running through farm equipment at the moment, a rusted hand plow going for $2 and a hay rake for $1.50, and Annie stood near the back and waited, watching the crowd with the cautious attention she had developed over the past year. She noted the ranchers near the front, thick-shouldered men in good hats who bought and paid without sentiment. She noted the drifters along the wall, men between places who bought small things with money that might belong to someone else. She noted the shopkeepers, the farmers, the one well-dressed man from the railroad company who came to auctions to look at land parcels. And then she noted the man in the far corner. He was standing against the rough plank wall with his arms folded, and his hat pulled just low enough that she could not read his face from across the room. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark canvas coat that had seen weather. He was not looking at the items being auctioned. He was not talking to anyone. He was simply standing there with the quality of stillness that Annie associated either with very patient hunters or with men who had learned to go unnoticed on purpose. She looked away. She had enough problems without studying strange men in corners. When Amos Greer called for jewelry items, Annie made her way to the front. She handed the ring to Greer's assistant, a pimpled young man named Roy who held the piece up to the window light and turned it critically, squinting. "Gold band, rose diamond, lady's ring," Greer announced, holding it up between his thumb and forefinger so the late morning light caught the stone. "Fine estate piece. Who'll start me at $20? Annie stood beside the auctioneer's table because Greer required sellers of small valuables to remain visible during the sale, some practice he had adopted after a string of fraudulent pieces had been sold 2 years back. She stood straight and kept her face composed, though the act of watching her ring held up by a stranger, while a room full of people assessed its worth, was one of the more degrading experiences of her adult life. She told herself it was just metal, just a stone. Thomas was in the ground under the cottonwood, and he would not want her to lose the farm over sentiment. $20, said a voice from the middle of the crowd. A man in a checked wool coat, a buyer she recognized as a jeweler from Wichita who came through Caldwell every few weeks. 25, said another voice. 30, said the Wichita jeweler, going brisk. 35, said someone Annie couldn't see. The jeweler paused, calculated, nodded. 40. The bidding stalled there. $40 for a gold band with a quarter-carat diamond was a reasonable price for the year and the market, and the room seemed to sense the number had found its ceiling. Amos Greer began his cadence, $40 going once, $40 going twice, and Annie felt the mathematics of her situation close around her like a fist. $40. Added to her 62, that was $102. Still 13 short of the bank payment. Still not enough. She was calculating whether she could find anything else to sell, whether the old rifle Thomas had kept above the door might bring enough, whether she could beg even a 2-week extension from the bank's loan officer, when a voice came from the far corner of the room. $80. The room turned. The man in the dark coat had not moved from his position against the wall. He had not unfolded his arms. He had simply spoken, in a voice that was low and direct, the kind of voice that expected to be heard without needing to be loud. Amos Greer blinked. "Gentleman in the corner bids $80 for the lady's gold ring." The Wichita jeweler turned to look at the man in the corner, made the same rapid calculation every experienced buyer makes when someone bids irrationally, and shook his head. No jeweler in Kansas would pay $80 for a $40 ring. Whatever that man in the corner was doing, it was not buying jewelry for resale. $80 going once, Greer said, with the particular care of a man who wanted to make sure he had heard right and that the money was real. $80 going twice. The room was very quiet. Sold to the gentleman in the corner for $80. Annie stood still for a moment, the blood moving strangely in her ears. She had just watched a stranger pay twice the ring's value. Her eyes went automatically to the corner. He was already moving toward the auctioneer's table, pulling bills from inside his coat. He set them on the table without fuss, counted exactly right, took the ring from Roy's hand and turned away. Annie took 2 steps forward. "Wait," she said. He stopped. He turned, and for the first time she saw his face clearly in the light from the high windows. He was perhaps 30, 31 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and a face that was weathered by time spent outside, strong-jawed, quiet around the eyes. The eyes themselves were a particular shade of gray-blue that she would spend a good deal of time thinking about later. There was a thin scar along the left side of his jaw, old and white, the kind that came from something serious that had happened years ago and healed imperfectly. He looked at her. His expression was entirely unreadable. "Sir," Annie said, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out. "You paid twice what that ring is worth. I need to understand why." "I paid what I wanted to pay," he said. His voice up close had a quality to it like good timber, solid and without ornament. "That's not an answer," Annie said. He studied her for a moment. Then he held the ring out toward her, balanced on his open palm. She stared at it. "What are you doing?" "Returning it," he said. "You can't return it. You bought it." "I can do what I like with it. It's mine. I'm giving it to you." Annie looked from the ring to his face and back again. Around them the auction had resumed, Greer calling out a set of harness leathers, the crowd shifting its attention back to the business of commerce. She and this man were momentarily in their own pocket of stillness amid the noise. "I don't accept charity," she said. "I know," he said, as though he already knew quite a lot about her, which was unsettling. He closed his fingers around the ring. "Then I'll keep it, but you have your money." He put the ring in his coat pocket and walked out through the wide doors of the auction house into the October sun. Annie stood for a full 10 seconds before she moved. Then she collected the $80 from Amos Greer's assistant, folded it into her coat pocket beside the $62 she already carried, and walked out into the street. He was gone. Main Street ran 4 blocks long in Caldwell. She looked both directions. The man in the dark coat had vanished as thoroughly as smoke in a wind. There was the hotel, the general store, the land office, the barber, the 2 saloons, the freight office, the livery at the far end. People moved between these establishments in the ordinary business of a Thursday morning. None of them was him. She stood on the plank sidewalk for a long moment with $142 in her pocket, thinking that she had just watched the strangest act of generosity she had ever witnessed, and that she didn't even know the man's name. Then she walked to the bank and paid the mortgage. The bank officer, a doughy man named Elias Prout, who smelled of hair pomade, and who had never once offered her a sympathetic look during the 14 months she had been managing Thomas's debts, stamped her payment receipt with the particular satisfaction of a man who had not expected to receive his money. He handed her the stamped paper and said, "Mrs. Gentry," in the tone of a man concluding a business transaction, and Annie said, "Mr. Prout," in the same tone, and walked out into the sunshine with the receipt folded in her pocket and the ring gone from her finger. She stopped on the bank steps and looked down at her bare left hand. There was a faint indentation on her ring finger where the band had sat for 3 years, a pale groove in the skin, slowly filling in. She pressed her thumb across it. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel all of it. Then she set her jaw in the line her mother had called her best feature and walked back toward the widow Hargrove's house to plan what came next. What came next was getting through the winter. She had enough to cover the mortgage, but nothing to spare for coal and food, and the dozen small necessities that a prairie winter demanded. She had been taking in laundry from the hotel since September, a hard and unglamorous business that left her hands raw and her back aching, but it produced steady income, and Caldwell's hotel had enough guests on any given week to keep her employed. She had also been doing mending for several of the town's families, and Mrs. Hargrove paid a small discount on her room in exchange for help with the cooking. It was not much of a life, but it was hers, and she was building it piece by piece, day by day, and she had learned in the past 14 months that this was the only way to build anything that lasted. She did not forget the man from the auction. She tried, after a fashion, because thinking about strangers who did inexplicable kindnesses was a luxury she could not afford. But the image of him standing in that corner, quiet and watchful, and then his hand extended with the ring resting on his palm, returned to her in odd moments. While she stirred laundry in the big boiling pot, while she sat at the window in the evening with her mending, while she walked the long way back from the general store with her purchases wrapped in paper. She asked around, carefully, the way you ask about things in a small town when you don't want people to know you're asking. She mentioned to Roy at the auction house that she had not caught the name of the gentleman who had purchased her ring. Roy shrugged and said he hadn't caught it either, that the man had paid in cash, which was unremarkable, and had given no name, which was also unremarkable among certain kinds of men who passed through cattle towns. She asked at the hotel desk whether a man fitting that description had been staying there. The clerk, a young man named Douglas who was eager to be helpful, described 3 different tall men in dark coats who had passed through in recent weeks and could not narrow it further. 2 weeks passed. October deepened into November, and the first cold front came rolling down from the north, carrying sleet that rattled against the windows of the widow Hargrove's house and turned the streets of Caldwell into cold mud. It was on a Thursday again, the second Thursday of November, that Annie saw him for the second time. She was coming out of Mercer's General Store with a paper-wrapped parcel of salt pork and dried beans when she nearly walked directly into him on the plank sidewalk. She caught herself. He caught himself. They stood for a half-second in the particular suspended moment of two people who have almost collided. "Mrs. Gentry," he said. She recovered herself. "You know my name. You sold a ring at Greer's auction. Greer required you to stand at the front. He announced your name when he called for the piece. He said this as simple fact, not as apology or excuse." "And your name?" Annie asked. He looked at her for a moment. The gray-blue eyes had that same quality she had noticed before, something watchful beneath the quiet. "Matthew Hadley," he said. "Mr. Hadley." She shifted her parcel. "Are you passing through Caldwell or staying?" "I have a property outside of town," he said. "I don't come in often." "You came to the auction," she said. "I come to auctions sometimes. I'm looking for particular items." He paused fractionally. "I found something that day that warranted the price." She looked at him squarely. "The ring is worth $40 at the outside." "I wasn't talking about the ring," he said. Annie felt heat come up in her face, which annoyed her considerably since she was not a woman given to blushing. She adjusted her grip on the parcel. "That is a peculiar thing to say to a woman you don't know, Mr. Hadley." Something shifted in his expression. It might have been embarrassment, or it might have been the beginning of something that looked very slightly like humor. "You're right. I apologize. I meant only that it seemed important that you keep the money." "Why?" she said. "Why would a man who doesn't know me care whether I keep the money from selling my wedding ring?" He was quiet for a moment. The sleet had stopped and the air between them carried cold and the smell of coming winter. "I knew your husband," he said. "Not well. We played cards together twice at the Longhorn Saloon 2 winters back. He talked about his farm, about his wife." A pause. "He seemed like a man who had something worth coming home to." Annie held very still. The grief was not sharp anymore, not the way it had been in those first weeks. It was more like a bruise now, one she had learned to work around. But someone saying Thomas's name still landed differently than anything else. "He was a good man," she said. "Yes," Matthew said. "He seemed that way." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, which was itself a strange thing given that they were two near strangers standing in the cold on a town sidewalk. "I should go," Annie said, because she should. "Mrs. Hargrove will need these for supper." "Of course," Matthew said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Gentry." She walked back toward Cedar Street with the parcel and the feeling that she had, without quite meaning to, become acquainted with Matthew Hadley. Over the following 3 weeks she saw him twice more in town, each time briefly. Once he held the door of the post office for her. Once he tipped his hat from across the street. Neither encounter lasted more than 30 seconds, but she found herself noticing when he was in town and when he wasn't, which was a habit she told herself was nothing more than the natural alertness of a woman living alone, accustomed to tracking the movements of the people around her. It was a Tuesday in the first week of December when everything shifted. Annie had taken on an additional piece of laundry work, washing and pressing linens for the land office in addition to the hotel, and she was coming back from her second delivery of the day, tired, and with the particular edge that came from too much physical work in cold weather, when she passed the Longhorn Saloon and heard raised voices inside. She would have walked past. She had no business in saloons and less desire to be involved in whatever was transpiring there. But she heard, beneath the louder voices, the particular quality of a voice trying to stay calm against pressure, and she recognized it. She pushed through the half-doors. The Longhorn was a middling saloon, better than the place on the edge of town that catered to the rougher cattle trade, but nothing like the establishment she had heard existed in Wichita and Dodge City. It was dim and smelled of sawdust and whiskey and smoke. 3 men at the bar were the focus of the noise. 2 of them were the Dancer brothers, Clyde and Warren, who were known in Caldwell as men who drank too much and made poor decisions when they drank. They were big men, both of them, with the particular belligerence of people who had been allowed to be difficult for too long without consequence. The third man was Matthew Hadley. He was standing very still at the bar, and Annie could see the quality of that stillness from the doorway. It was not the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of a man who had decided on a course of action and was giving the situation one last opportunity to resolve itself before he acted on that decision. "You cheated at cards last spring," Clyde Dancer was saying, his voice loud and loose with whiskey. "Everybody knows it. You took $50 off my brother that night and it wasn't clean." "Your brother lost $50 playing poker," Matthew said, and his voice was exactly as level as his posture. "He lost it because he played a poor hand poorly. That's not cheating. That's cards. You calling my brother stupid," Warren Dancer said, which was not precisely what Matthew had said. Annie could see that this was going to go badly in approximately the next 60 seconds unless something changed. The two Dancer brothers were drunk and looking for a fight, and Matthew Hadley was one man against two, and while he looked capable of handling himself, the arithmetic of 1 against 2 in a saloon argument rarely produced a good outcome. She walked to the bar. She had no particular plan. She was simply there before she had fully decided to be there, which was a character trait her mother had called impulsive and her father had called courageous, and which she thought of as simply the thing that happened when she saw a situation that could be helped. "Matthew," she said, as if she had been looking for him. She put her hand on his arm and felt him go briefly rigid with surprise before he caught himself. "There you are. Mrs. Hargrove's been asking for you. She says you were going to look at that fence post-business before dark." There was a silence. Matthew looked at her. She looked at him. In the space of a second something passed between them, an assessment and a decision and a mutual agreement to go along with whatever this was. "You're right," he said. "I lost track of time." "Is this your woman?" Clyde Dancer said, with the specific disdainful emphasis that drunk men used when they wanted to diminish both parties at once. "She is not my woman," Matthew said, with the calm precision of a man choosing his words carefully. "She is a friend, and I'll thank you to use a respectful tone." "Oh, will you?" Clyde said and took a step. "Clyde," said the bartender, a lean man named Pete who had been watching this with the resigned expression of someone who had mopped blood off this floor before and preferred not to do it again. "You want to think about what happens next before you take that step." It was the pause that saved it. Clyde looked at Pete. Pete looked back with absolute steadiness. Warren put a hand on his brother's arm, sensing something, and the moment passed from the edge of violence back into mere unpleasantness. "You watch yourself, Hadley," Clyde said, and turned back to his drink. Annie and Matthew walked out of the saloon into the cold December air. They stood on the sidewalk and Annie released a breath she had been holding without realizing it. "That was an interesting invention," Matthew said. "I didn't want anyone getting their teeth knocked in on a Tuesday afternoon," Annie said. "I had it handled," he said. "You had two drunk men handled. That's a different thing." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" He looked slightly taken aback, as if the question surprised him. "I'm fine." "Good." She picked up her empty basket, which she had set down at some point during the episode without noticing. "Well then, Mrs. Gentry," he said. She stopped. "Have you had supper?" She turned back. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely decode, something careful and slightly uncertain, which was the first uncertain thing she had seen from him and which made him, oddly, more real to her than anything before. "I have not," she said. "There's a restaurant on the second block," he said. "Nothing fancy, but the food is good and it's warm." Annie considered him for a moment. She thought about Thomas, about the ring, about the $80, about the way he had walked out of the auction house and disappeared, and then turned up again like something the river brings back. She thought about the fact that she was cold and tired and had not had a proper meal with company in 14 months. "All right," she said. The restaurant was called Caldwell's and was run by a woman named Vera Caldwell who was not, as far as anyone knew, related to the town's founding family but had taken the name for the establishment regardless. It was warm inside, lit by 3 oil lamps and a good fire, and it smelled of beef stew and fresh bread, and Annie felt something unknot in her shoulders when they sat down. They talked, carefully at first, in the way of people who are simultaneously interested and cautious, asking the small questions that reveal the larger things. She learned that Matthew had come to Kansas from Missouri 6 years ago, that he had worked cattle drives for 4 years, that he had saved enough to buy 160 acres outside Caldwell 2 years past, that he ran a small but serious cattle operation and was in the process of building it up. He had no family nearby, a sister in St. Louis who he wrote to irregularly, parents long gone. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, that she had come west with Thomas in 1875, that she had loved the plains despite everything, that she intended to keep the farm and make it work because she had put too much of herself into that land to let it go. He asked questions that were direct and attentive. He listened to her answers with the full quality of his attention, which was something she had not experienced often enough to be entirely comfortable with. She found herself talking more than she intended. He walked her back to the widow Hargrove's house after supper. At the gate he touched his hat. "Thank you for the fence post story," he said. "Thank you for supper," she said. "Mrs. Gentry." He hesitated, and she saw again that trace of uncertainty, brief as a cloud crossing a clear sky. "I wondered if you might permit me to call on you, properly." Annie looked at her bare left hand briefly and then back at him. "I think that would be acceptable, Mr. Hadley," she said. "Yes." He called on her the following Sunday, arriving at the widow Hargrove's door with his hat in his hands and a paper-wrapped parcel of early winter apples, which he presented to Mrs. Hargrove with a courtesy that made the old widow smile and set aside her initial suspicious appraisal. They sat in the parlor and talked for 2 hours while Mrs. Hargrove made occasional excuses to pass through the room and ensure propriety was maintained. He called on her the Sunday after that, and the one after that. By Christmas she had taken to watching for his horse on Sunday mornings, and she was doing it before she admitted to herself that she was doing it. They rode out to her farm together on a Sunday late in December, after the first real snow had laid a clean white over the fields. She had not been back since she had moved into town in September. The empty house looked smaller under the snow, the windows dark, the barn quiet. The cottonwood at the edge of the field where Thomas was buried stood bare-branched and still. She stood at the field edge for a moment, and Matthew stood quietly beside her, not speaking, not moving away. "I'm going to come back here in the spring," she said. "Get the fields planted again, figure out the cattle." "That's a lot of work for one person," Matthew said, not dismissively, factually. "I know," she said. "I've been doing a lot of work for one person." He was quiet for a moment. The snow lay over everything in its impartial way. "I have a good horse I can lend you for the spring plowing," he said, "stronger than what you'd hire." "Thank you," she said. They stood together in the cold and white silence, and Annie was aware of the warmth coming off the man beside her, the solidity of him, and she thought that she had been alone for a long time, and that alone was a temperature all its own, one she had grown so accustomed to that warmth, when it appeared, felt almost strange. They rode back to town as the afternoon light turned the snow a pale gold. At the widow Hargrove's gate he helped her down from the saddle, and for a moment they stood close in the gathering dusk, her hand still in his from the dismount. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. "Annie," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name, and it fell into the cold air between them with a quiet weight. "Matthew," she said. He released her hand slowly. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she agreed. It was not a declaration. It was not a kiss. It was the particular kind of moment that stands for all the things not yet said, the kind that you carry back inside with you and turn over in the warmth of your room later, examining it from all angles while the fire pops and the wind moves against the windows. January came in hard, the way Kansas winters did, with a blue-gray cold that was serious and uncompromising. Matthew's visits continued with the regularity of a man who had made a decision and was acting on it. He helped her fix the chimney flue in the room she rented when it started drawing badly. He brought wood. He brought books from the small lending library that the Methodist Church maintained, selecting them with a care that suggested he had been paying attention to what she had mentioned enjoying. She began to understand him in the way you understand someone through accumulated small details. He was a methodical man, not a brilliant one but a thorough one, the kind who thought a problem through completely before acting, and who rarely had to reconsider because he had not rushed. He had a dry, quiet sense of humor that emerged in odd moments, the kind that required you to be paying close attention to catch it. He was careful with money in the way of someone who had not always had it and intended never again to be without it. He read more than most men she had known. He was gentle with animals. He was not easy to know quickly. He gave things slowly, carefully, the way a man gives things he values and does not want to lose. But every week she learned something new, and every week the shape of him in her understanding became more complete, more detailed, more real. She told him, one Sunday evening in January when the fire was low and Mrs. Hargrove had retired and they sat with the comfortable quiet of people who had been talking for 3 hours and were now simply present together, that she was grateful for what he had done at the auction. "You didn't have to do that," she said, "paying twice the worth of it. I want you to know that I know what it meant." He looked into the fire for a moment. "I walked in that day with no plan to buy anything," he said. "I heard Greer announce your name when you brought the piece up. I'd heard about Thomas through town talk. I knew who you were." He was quiet. "When I saw you standing there with that ring in Greer's hands, I thought, here is a woman doing the hardest thing, and she deserves not to have to do it for $40. Annie was very still. "That was all it was," he said. At first, she said very quietly. He looked at her. "You must know," he said with the careful directness that she had come to think of as the essential quality of him, "that it is considerably more than that now." Annie set down her cup. The fire crackled. Outside, the winter moved against the house with its cold, patient pressure. "Yes," she said, "I know." And then, because she was Annie Gentry, and she did not do things by halves, she reached across and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. He turned his hand palm up and closed it around hers, and they sat like that in front of the fire until the last of it burned down to embers, not saying anything more because nothing more needed to be said just then. February brought with it the kind of prairie cold that turned the world to iron and ice, and it also brought a problem that Annie had been half expecting and half hoping would go away on its own, which was the question of what to do about her farm. The land itself was worth something. The 160 acres of the Gentry claim sat on good soil, with reliable water access from a small creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and it had been Thomas's intention to build it into a proper working farm. Annie had kept the claim current through the hard year by making the mortgage payments, but what she had not been able to maintain was the actual operation of the farm. The fields had sat empty and fallow in the summer and fall. The house had been shut up. The livestock was gone. She needed to get back on the land in the spring. She needed seed. She needed equipment. She needed a plan that was more than one woman with a borrowed horse and an iron will. She had been thinking about this for weeks when Matthew arrived on a Sunday in mid-February with a purposeful look that she recognized as the face of a man who had been thinking about a problem and had arrived at an answer. "I have a proposition," he said, once they were settled in the parlor. "Go ahead," Annie said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he always was before saying something that mattered to him. "My property is 120 acres. Your claim is 160. They don't border each other, but they're 4 miles apart, which is close enough to manage jointly. If we combined the operations, we could run a full cattle operation on your water access and plant the north field with winter wheat on my place. My barn is good and your soil quality is better. Combined, we'd have enough to make a serious go of it." Annie looked at him carefully. "That's a farming argument," she said. "Is it only a farming argument?" He met her eyes. "No," he said. "It is not only a farming argument." "Then say the rest of it," she said. He put both his hands on his knees in the way he did when he was steadying himself for something. "Annie," he said, I would like to marry you, if you'll have me, not because of the farm, though the farm is a sensible reason. Because I would like to spend the rest of my days with you, and I have been fairly certain of that since sometime around the first week of December when you walked into the Longhorn Saloon and invented a story about fence posts. Annie's breath went out of her slowly. Matthew, she said, I know it's not a year yet since we met, he said. I know you've had a great deal to manage, and I know you value your independence, and I am not suggesting you give any of that up. I'm suggesting we build something together that's better than either of us build separately. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the February wind moved through the eaves of the widow Hargrove's house with its cold commentary. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the ring and the auction, and the strange turning point of that October morning. She thought about what she knew of Matthew Hadley, which was now quite a lot, accumulated week by week through the particular intimacy of sustained, honest attention. She thought about the farm under the snow and the spring that was still coming, always coming, regardless. Yes, she said. He went very still for a moment, as if he had prepared himself for more resistance, and the simplicity of the answer caught him off balance. Yes, she said again. Ask me properly. He slid off the chair and onto one knee on the parlor rug, and he took her hands in both of his, and he said, Annie Gentry, will you marry me? With the clear gravity of a man who knew what he was asking and what it meant. Yes, Matthew Hadley, she said. I will. He stood and she stood, and he held her face in his hands and kissed her, carefully at first and then less carefully. And through the parlor wall they could both hear the sound of Mrs. Hargrove's rocking chair, which had been in steady motion all evening, going abruptly and tellingly silent. They were married on the 15th of March, 1879, in the Methodist Church on Elm Street. The minister was a spare man named Reverend Colby, who performed the ceremony with efficiency and genuine warmth. Mrs. Hargrove attended and wept decorously into her good handkerchief. Roy from the auction house came because Annie had taken the trouble of inviting people she knew. Pete the bartender from the Longhorn came, as did Vera Caldwell and 3 of the town's shopkeepers, and a number of other people who had watched the preceding months with the approving attention that small communities give to love stories when they are progressing satisfactorily. Annie wore her good gray dress, altered to fit properly, with a piece of blue ribbon that had belonged to her mother. She carried a small bunch of dried winter flowers that Vera Caldwell had saved from her autumn garden specifically for this occasion. She walked down the short aisle of the Methodist church alone because she had no family in Kansas, and she walked it with her chin up and her eyes on Matthew. He was standing at the front of the church in a dark suit that she had not seen before, and she understood that he had gone to some expense for it, and this moved her more than she expected. He was clean-shaved, his dark hair combed back, his gray-blue eyes on her with the full quality of his attention. When she reached him, he took her hand and she felt the steadiness of him, that particular quality that she had come to think of as the thing she would trust most completely in the world. They said their vows. Reverend Colby read from the book. Matthew's voice was level and clear when he made his promises, and Annie's voice was steady and sure. When the ring was placed on her finger, it was a plain gold band that Matthew had bought at the jeweler's on the main block, simple and solid and new. He had offered to try to recover the original ring from the Wichita jeweler who had lost the bid at the auction, but Annie had said no. That ring was Thomas's grandmother's ring, and it belonged to a different life. This new ring was for the life she was beginning. When the minister said, "You may kiss your wife," Matthew turned to her with that slight shift in his expression that she had learned to read as warmth running beneath the quiet surface of him, and he kissed her in front of Caldwell's Methodist congregation with a tenderness that made Mrs. Hargrove produce her handkerchief again. They had supper at Vera Caldwell's restaurant with half the town's population, it seemed, crowding in and raising glasses and making toasts. Pete had brought a bottle of decent whiskey. Mrs. Hargrove had made a cake. The evening was warm and loud and good-natured, and Annie sat beside her husband, his hand over hers on the table, and felt the particular quality of a life turning in a new direction. Later, riding out to Matthew's property in the clear March night with the first real smell of spring beginning in the air, the stars overhead in their vast Kansas abundance, she leaned her shoulder against his on the wagon seat and he put his arm around her. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. "You." He was quiet in the way he always was, but the arm around her tightened briefly, and that was his answer. Matthew's property was a solid if unfinished place. The house was small, 2 rooms built well with good lumber, set on a rise that gave it a clear view in 3 directions. There was a proper barn, better than Thomas's had been, built with the care of a man who took his livestock seriously. There was a kitchen garden in a state of winter dormancy, a good well, a root cellar dug into the hillside. It was not a grand house, but it was built to last, and it was built by someone who had thought about what lasted and why. And this meant something to Annie, who had spent the past 18 months learning the difference between things built to stand and things built to impress. She set herself to making it a home with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She planted the kitchen garden in April, extending it considerably beyond its previous boundaries. She organized the house, found its logic, improved upon it. She put her mother's Ohio recipe for apple preserves into practice with the first of the season's apples. She repaired the curtains in the bedroom window and hung the small braided rug that had come with her from Cedar Street. They went to work on the combined operation with the precision of 2 people who had both been managing things alone for long enough to know what a well-organized effort looked like. Matthew's cattle and the water access of Annie's Gentry claim proved to be exactly the combination that arithmetic had suggested. By June, they had 30 head running on the creek pasture. They had hired a hand, a young man of 20 named Eli Dawson, who was reliable and good with horses, to help with the driving and fencing work. Annie managed the accounts with the same meticulous attention she had given to her survival arithmetic during the hard year. She kept the ledger in a small book with a blue cover, every number entered in her clear hand. She understood both properties' financials completely, knew exactly where they stood at any given week, knew which expenses were essential and which could wait. Matthew, who had been managing his own books in the casual way of a man who trusted his instincts more than his figures, discovered that his instincts and her figures arrived at the same conclusions, which made them laugh and also confirmed something they had each suspected about the other. They were, it turned out, remarkably well suited. Not in the way of identical people, which they were not. They were different in their rhythms, different in how they moved through the day, different in temperament at the edges where it counted. Matthew was slow to speak and Annie was quick. Matthew trusted patience and Annie trusted action. Matthew thought problems through from the inside and Annie worked them from the outside. But they were alike in the things that mattered. They were both serious about what they built. They were both honest past the point of comfort sometimes. They both believed that a day's work deserved a day's effort, and that the land gave back what you put into it if you were paying proper attention. They both thought that what you promised mattered more than what you felt like on a given morning. The arguments they had were real ones, honest and direct, over real disagreements, and they resolved them in the same way they resolved every other problem, by laying the pieces out plainly and finding the logic that held. They never went to bed with unfinished anger. This was not a rule they set but a thing they discovered about themselves, that neither of them could sleep well with unresolved matters sitting in the house, and so they resolved them. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and Eli had gone back to the bunkroom in the barn, and the fire was burning low, they sat together, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and Annie thought with a private astonishment that she had not expected to find this, had not dared to plan for it, had been in the middle of learning how to live without it when it had found her in the most unexpected way possible, in the dusty lamplight of an auction house on a Thursday morning in October. She had not forgotten the specific moment he had walked out of that auction house and disappeared. She thought about it sometimes with a complicated feeling, gratitude and curiosity, and something that retroactively shivered her. He had been a stranger. He had paid $80 for her ring and walked out without an explanation and vanished into the street. One evening in June, lying in bed in the blue evening light with the window open to the spring air, she asked him directly, "That day at the auction, why did you walk out? You could have simply introduced yourself. You could have explained. Why did you disappear?" He was quiet for a moment. The curtain she had hung moved in the evening air. "I didn't know how to say what I wanted to say," he said. "I could see that you were proud and that you were managing, and that the last thing you needed was someone making it more complicated. So I did the thing that needed doing, and then I left you alone to do what you needed to do." "You could have introduced yourself anyway," she said. "I thought about it," he said. "I walked out into the street and I stood there for a good half-minute thinking about walking back in. Then I thought, she just sold her wedding ring to save her farm. This is not the moment." Annie looked at the ceiling. "That was sensible of you," she said. "I was not feeling particularly sensible," he said. "I was feeling like a man who had just walked out on the most interesting woman he'd seen in several years and was going to have to find a reason to come back." She turned her head to look at him. In the dim light his face was turned toward hers, the gray-blue eyes that she could read completely now after all these months, every register of them. "You found a reason," she said. "I did," he said. "Several." She reached over in the dark and took his hand the way she had that first evening in the Widow Hargrove's parlor, and he turned his hand palm up and closed it around hers. And they lay in the June evening with the curtains moving and the cattle quiet in the pasture and the creek running somewhere in the dark. And Annie thought that the particular quality of this happiness was its completeness, that it did not have the anxious edge of luck about it but the solid weight of something earned. The summer passed in the way of working summers on the Kansas plains, long and hard, and full of weather that made no promises. They had a late thunderstorm in July that bent the corn in the north field and required 3 days of work to assess and manage the damage. They lost 2 calves to a summer illness that moved through the pasture in August, a genuine blow to the season's returns, but not a catastrophic one because Annie had been running the numbers conservatively all season, and they had the margin to absorb it. They went to the cattle market in Wichita in September, driving 20 head up the trail with Eli and a borrowed hand from the neighboring Pierce ranch. It was the first time Annie had made the drive, and she had insisted on going, over Matthew's mild and quickly abandoned suggestion that it might be easier if she stayed back. She rode beside him on the trail for 3 days and slept on the ground with her hat over her face and helped manage the herd through the river crossing south of Wichita without losing a single animal. And Matthew watched her with an expression that she had learned to identify as the specific look of a man whose respect is growing in real time. They sold well in Wichita, better than she had projected, because beef prices had come up from their summer lows. They stayed one night in a hotel in Wichita, the first time either of them had slept in a real hotel bed in years, and they had a good dinner and a bottle of wine that was better than anything available in Caldwell, and sat across the table from each other in the restaurant of the hotel with the satisfied quiet of people who have done what they set out to do. "Good season," Annie said. "Good season," he agreed. "Better than I'd projected." "I projected it exactly," she said. He smiled then, the full version, which was different from his usual near smile, the way a summer sky is different from a winter one. "You did," he said. "You're very good at numbers." "I'm very good at a great many things," she said. "You're still learning them." "I am," he said. "I'm enjoying the education." Coming back to Caldwell in October, almost exactly a year from the day she had stood in the auction house with her ring in a square of cloth in her pocket, Annie felt the turn of time with a vivid sharpness. She did not mention the date to Matthew, expecting to note it privately and move on, but when they rode in through town on the Thursday, Matthew turned the wagon down Main Street and drew up in front of Greer's auction house. "What are we stopping for?" she said. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and held out something on his open palm. It was her wedding ring, Thomas's grandmother's ring, the gold band with the rose-cut diamond, worn from years of being on hands that worked. She looked at it and looked at him. "I went to Wichita in the spring," he said. "Found the jeweler who'd bid on it at the auction. He still had it. He sold it back to me for a decent price." He paused. "I didn't give it to you when I got it back because I didn't want to give it to you at the wrong moment. A year seemed right." Annie sat on the wagon seat in the October sun outside the auction house where everything had begun, and she looked at the ring in his hand, and she felt something enormous move through her that was too large for the word feeling and too specific for the word emotion. It was grief and gratitude and love all braided together, the past and the present meeting cleanly in a single point. "Matthew," she said. "It's Thomas's ring," he said quietly. "It doesn't have to mean anything other than that it's yours and it belongs with you. You don't have to wear it. I just wanted you to have it back." She picked it up from his palm. She held it for a moment, this small gold circle that had been on her hand through one life and had been sold and returned and now was here again. Then she put it on her right hand. He looked at the right hand. He looked at the gold band on her left, the one he had placed there on the 15th of March in the Methodist Church. "Right seems correct," she said. "Two different things, both real." He covered both her hands briefly with his. Then he kissed her there on the wagon seat in front of the auction house, while Amos Greer's assistant Roy watched with frank interest from the window. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was a good one, as Kansas winters went. Cold and clear, with a clean deep snow in January that sat in the fields like a blanket and promised good soil moisture for the spring planting. The cattle had done well in the fall, and the ledger was in solid shape for the first time in Annie's recent memory. She and Matthew sat at the kitchen table one evening in February with the book spread between them and went through the numbers together, and the numbers were good. They talked about expanding the herd. They talked about the South Field, whether to put it in wheat or try corn again. They talked about the house, which was beginning to feel somewhat small, and whether the addition Matthew had been thinking about on the north side made financial sense given the other priorities. The addition, Annie said, made excellent financial sense given recent developments. He looked at her across the table with the specific quality of sudden attention that was different from his usual attention. She watched him work it out. It took him perhaps 4 seconds, which she thought was admirable speed for a man of his generally methodical processing. "Annie," he said. "June, I think," she said, "or possibly July." He was very still for a moment in the way he had been still in the auction house that day, but it was entirely different stillness, the stillness of something vast moving through a person who was trying to hold all of it at once. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I'm perfectly well," she said, with the precision of a woman who had already been through every possible feeling on the subject and had arrived at steady and certain. "I'm very well." He came around the table and pulled her up into his arms with a swiftness that was entirely unlike his usual careful movements, and held her against him with the kind of force that says everything that cannot be said, and Annie pressed her face into the shoulder of his flannel shirt and felt the particular quality of being held by someone who means it entirely. "Matthew," she said, her voice somewhat muffled by his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I know. They built the addition. It went up in April and May. Matthew and Eli and 2 men from town working through the early spring weather with the urgency of people who had a deadline. It was a good room, well built with good lumber, the window facing east to catch the morning light. Annie made curtains for it from a length of calico she had been saving. She built the small bed frame herself from pine planks, with Matthew's help and a good deal of discussion about the best joinery method, and it was sturdier than she had expected, and she was proud of it. The baby was born in the last week of June, on a day that was warm and clear with a good wind off the plains, the kind of day that Kansas produced sometimes in high summer as if to balance out the hard ones. He was born with dark hair like his father's and eyes that couldn't yet be red for color, but would turn, over the following weeks, to a warm brown that was entirely his own. They named him Thomas Matthew Hadley. Thomas for the man who had first tilled this Kansas soil in Annie's life, and Matthew for the man who sat beside her now in the lamplight of the bedroom looking at his son, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and would never quite be able to describe afterward, except to say that it was like watching someone understand something important for the first time. "Hello, Thomas," Matthew said quietly, his voice almost nothing at all, barely there above the quiet of the summer house. The baby's eyes moved toward the sound. Eli came to the door that evening with his hat in his hands, looking equal parts delighted and terrified in the way of young men confronted with the fact of new life, and Annie told him he could come in and have a look if he washed his hands first. He washed them with excessive thoroughness and stood over the small bed with a huge and helpless smile. "He looks like you, Mr. Hadley," Eli said. "Does he?" Matthew said. "He has Mrs. Hadley's jawline, though," Eli added, which made Annie laugh from the bed, which was the best sound the house had contained in a very long time. The summer rolled on around them with its usual indifference to human milestones, the cattle needing tending, the crops needing managing, the daily work of a working place not pausing because there was a new person in the world. But everything was different now, and they both knew it. The house that had been Matthew's and then theirs was now something else, a family place, with all the weight and the warmth that word carried. Annie was back on her feet in 10 days and fully operational in 2 weeks, because she was Annie Gentry Hadley, and the cattle did not care about her recovery schedule. Matthew watched her with the specific expression of a man torn between admiration and the desire to make her rest, and Annie watched him watch her with the specific expression of a woman who loves someone and finds their concern both touching and unnecessary. "I'm fine," she said, for the 14th time in 2 weeks. "I know," he said. "You're always fine, it's worrying. You worry too much," she said. "Someone has to," he said. She stopped what she was doing at the kitchen table and looked at him across the room with the full attention she gave him when he said something that landed differently than the words expected. He was at the window with Thomas in his arms, the baby awake and alert in the way he had been increasingly alert over his first weeks, watching the world with his warm brown eyes as if there was a great deal worth cataloging. "Someone has to," she said again, softly. "Yes, I suppose that's true." He looked at her over the baby's head with those gray-blue eyes. "I love you," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said everything that mattered to her, directly and without ornament. He was quiet for a moment in his way. Then, "I know," he said. "I love you too, Annie, and then, I have since the fence posts." She laughed, a full, genuine laugh, and Thomas made the small, startled noise he made when something surprised him, and Matthew looked down at him with the enormous, helpless tenderness that had become the daily expression of his face when he held his son. And Annie thought that if she were asked to identify the best moment of her life, she would have difficulty choosing between this one and several others from the past year, and that this difficulty was itself the answer. The following spring they put in the biggest planting they had yet attempted, wheat across the North 40 and corn along the creek pasture, and hired Eli on full time with a proper wage instead of the seasonal arrangement they had been using. It was a statement of intention and confidence, and the land honored it. The summer of 1881 was a good one, warm and adequately watered, the kind of summer the Kansas plains produced every few years as if to remind you why people came here, and the harvest in August was the best they had achieved. They sold their wheat through the new grain elevator that had opened just south of town, a development of the railroad expansion that was changing the economics of the region in ways both useful and complicated. Annie watched the railroad's arrival in the county with the careful attention she gave to all large economic forces, seeing both the opportunity and the disruption in it, noting which neighbors adapted quickly and which were caught off guard. It was in September of 1881 that Clyde Dancer, who had apparently not improved as a human being in the intervening years, created a problem that required resolving. The Dancer brothers' family held a small claim that bordered the southeastern corner of the Gentry property, The old Gentry claimed that Annie now ran as part of the combined Hadley operation. The claim had been in dispute on and off for 2 years, a question of a fence line that had never been properly surveyed when the original claims were filed. It was the kind of boundary disagreement that the Western territories produced by the dozens, and it was usually resolved either by survey or by practical agreement between reasonable neighbors. The dancers were not particularly reasonable neighbors. Clyde had taken to grazing his 3 cattle on the wrong side of the disputed fence line, which was both legally questionable and practically irritating. Matthew had spoken to him twice about it, quietly and directly, and twice Clyde had made noises of agreement and then continued doing it. Warren, the quieter brother, had actually seemed embarrassed about the situation the second time Matthew spoke to him, but he deferred to Clyde and Clyde deferred to his own worst impulses. On a Tuesday morning in September, Annie rode out to the Gentry property to check on the fence repair that Eli had been doing along the eastern boundary, and found Clyde Dancer's 3 cattle in the south pasture, which was not in the disputed zone at all but clearly and indisputably on her side of any reasonable fence line. She found Clyde Dancer himself sitting on his horse nearby, watching the cattle graze with the proprietary ease of a man who had decided that the rules did not apply to him. "Mr. Dancer," Annie said, pulling up her horse, "your cattle are on my property." "It's disputed," Clyde said. "The south pasture is not disputed. It is clearly and entirely mine. I have the survey documentation from the county land office, and I will be happy to show it to you in detail." "I don't need a woman to show me survey documents," Clyde said, with the particular emphasis that made the insult clear. Annie looked at him with the steady, direct attention she had developed over several years of managing difficult situations without the luxury of losing her composure. She was not frightened of Clyde Dancer, who was a bully of the most ordinary variety. But she was also clear-eyed about what the situation was. "Your cattle are on my property," she said again. "I am asking you once to move them. If you choose not to, I will go to the county land office and the sheriff and address it through the appropriate process. I would rather not do that because it wastes everyone's time and costs everyone money, including you. But I will do it." She turned her horse and rode back toward home. Matthew and the sheriff had the matter sorted by the end of the week, with the county surveyor arriving to formally establish the fence line and a formal complaint filed against the Dancers for willful trespass on private property. Clyde Dancer was furious and loud about it for approximately 2 weeks, and then he discovered that being furious and loud was not changing anything, and that the survey had established Annie's position beyond argument, and he went back to being a middling, difficult neighbor instead of an active problem. It was not a dramatic resolution, but most real resolutions weren't. They were the product of patience and documentation, and the willingness to stand firm without escalating, and Annie had learned both of those things in her years on the Kansas plains. Matthew had ridden with her to the land office and sat beside her through the sheriff's meeting, not speaking unless spoken to because she had it entirely in hand, and he knew it, and his being there was a different kind of support, the kind that said, "I am here," not the kind that said, "Let me handle this." She noticed this. She loved him for it. By the end of 1881, the Hadley operation was the kind of solid, well-run, well-regarded small ranch that attracted notice among their neighbors. Not the largest outfit in the county, but one of the most consistently productive, because both people running it were paying precise attention, and because they trusted each other's judgment completely, which meant that when one of them had an idea, the other could disagree with it on the merits instead of on the politics, and the best ideas survived. Little Thomas turned 1.5 and began walking with a determined and slightly alarming velocity, heading toward whatever interested him with the complete confidence of someone who had never yet had a reason to doubt his own ability to get where he was going. He had Annie's dark brown hair and Matthew's gray-blue eyes, as it turned out, a combination that made Mrs. Hargrove, who visited regularly, say each time that she had never seen a more handsome child, which she also said every time regardless of how handsome the child in question actually was. But in this case, it happened to be true. They took a Sunday in October and rode out together, the three of them, Matthew with Thomas in front of him in the saddle, Annie riding alongside, to the Gentry claim and the cottonwood at the field edge where Thomas's father was buried. Annie had been coming out to this spot regularly since they had taken over managing the property, bringing small things, keeping it tended, the way you tend the places that matter. Matthew held the baby while Annie stood at the grave marker for a while in the October light. The tree had gone gold with the season, its leaves turning, the field beyond it brown and resting after the harvest. "He'd have liked you," she said, not quite to Matthew and not quite to herself. "I'd have liked him," Matthew said, "from what I knew of him." She turned back to him and the baby, and Thomas reached for her hair with his small, emphatic fist, and she disentangled herself from his grip and kissed his forehead, and they stood together in the October sun under the cottonwood for a few minutes longer before riding home. It was a good winter, that second one in the house with the addition. They had enough wood and enough food, and enough money in the account to face the cold, without the particular anxiety of scarcity that Annie had carried through the previous 2 winters. She had been carrying it so long that its absence felt at first like something missing rather than something solved, and then gradually she recognized it for what it was, which was safety, the basic material fact of safety, warm and sheltered and provisioned against whatever the season sent. She lay in bed one night in January with the snow outside, and the fire banked low and Matthew asleep beside her and Thomas asleep in the next room, and thought about the specific afternoon she had stood in front of the widow Hargrove's small mirror and taken off her ring. She had been so completely alone in that moment. She had been alone in such a thorough way that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be otherwise. She looked at her right hand in the dim light, the gold band with the rose diamond on her ring finger. She looked at her left hand, Matthew's plain gold band. Both real, 2 different things, both real. She had told him that, and she had meant it, that the past and the present were not in competition, that loving Matthew did not erase the years with Thomas, that a heart was not a house with only so many rooms. She had explained this to him once during a conversation they had had in the summer, quietly and honestly, and he had listened with his full attention and said, "I know," which was his way of saying, "I understand completely and I agree, and I am not asking you to choose." He was a good man. She had known a good man before and she recognized the quality. She turned over and fit herself against his back in the warm dark and closed her eyes, and outside the Kansas winter moved through its ancient business, indifferent and complete. Spring came again, as it always did, as it always would, and with it the season's work and the season's hope. Annie planted the kitchen garden, and then the south field, and then helped with the planting on the North 40. And the land that she had worked with Thomas, and then worked alone, and then worked together with Matthew, was another year deeper under her care. Another year more fully hers in the way that land becomes yours through the accumulated investment of your physical attention. She was expecting their second child by April, a discovery that she had made with the same matter-of-fact clarity she brought to all the pieces of her life, and that Matthew had received with the same enormous helpless wonder he had shown the first time, which she found both endearing and amusing, given that the event was less of a surprise this time than it had been. Thomas, who was nearly 2 and in command of a vocabulary of approximately 40 words, several of which he used constantly and several of which he had learned from Eli during fence-mending sessions, and which Annie was trying to discourage, was entirely uninterested in the news of a sibling's impending arrival and considerably more interested in the small spotted dog that had appeared at the barn that spring, and which he referred to as Dog, with a possessive certainty that suggested the dog's own opinion on ownership was irrelevant. The dog, which was female and had apparently been abandoned on the road, adopted them all with the pragmatic warmth of a creature that recognized a good situation when it found one. Eli named her Bess. Thomas called her Dog. She answered to both. The second baby arrived in October, a cool, clear October that was nothing like the October of the auction house, and everything like the best version of what Kansas could be, all wide sky and gold grass and clean wind. She was a girl this time, born as efficiently as a person can be born, with a good deal of hair and an expression of significant purpose. They named her Clara, for Annie's mother, who had died of a fever in Ohio when Annie was 17, a woman whose recipe book Annie had carried west and whose braided rug was on the bedroom floor, a woman who had never seen Kansas but who was woven into everything her daughter had built here. Clara Hadley turned out to have opinions from the beginning, about when she ate and when she did not eat, about the particular blanket that suited her and the ones that did not, about the question of whether any of the adults currently present were adequate to her immediate requirements, a question to which her initial answer was usually no. She was loud about this in the way that Thomas had never been. Thomas had been a watchful baby, alert and quiet, more interested in observing than in announcing. Clara observed and announced simultaneously. Thomas, at 2 years and several months, regarded his sister with the complex expression of someone who has been the singular focus of several adults' attention and has just discovered that this is no longer exclusively the case. He spent approximately a week being uncertain about this, and then decided that Clara was, on balance, interesting, and took to standing at the edge of her basket and offering her objects, a stick, a smooth stone, his hat, the dog's rope toy, evaluating her responses with the serious scientific method of a small person collecting data. Matthew watched his son watching his daughter from across the room with an expression that Annie had no word for, something in the range of enormous grateful bewilderment at the specific and unrepeatable particularity of the life he had arrived at. "What are you thinking?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment. The fire was going and the evening was early and both children were occupied, Thomas with his assessment project and Clara with the business of being Clara. "I'm thinking about October," he said, 3 years ago. "What about it?" she said, though she knew. "I walked into Greer's auction house because I needed a harness fitting," he said. "I was in the back looking at the tool table when Greer called your name to bring the ring up. I turned around and looked at you and he paused. I knew something. I didn't know what exactly. I just knew it was important. And so you paid $80 for a $40 ring," she said. "And then I ran away," he said, with the dry, slight humor that she loved in him. "You did not run away," she said. "You walked out with great composure and then stood in the street for 30 seconds being uncertain, which is entirely different." "How do you know about the 30 seconds? "Because I know you," she said. "Because you would have stood there for exactly the length of time it took to think it through and then moved." He looked at her with those gray-blue eyes. "You know me," he said. "I do," she said. "Rather well by now." He reached across and took her hand, the left one with the plain gold band, and held it in his, and Annie thought that this was the particular happiness that she had not known she was looking for, not the shining dramatic happiness of great gestures and declarations, though there had been those too, but this ordinary evening kind. This sitting by the fire with 2 children and a dog and a man who knew her, and was known by her, and had built this life with her piece by piece from the materials of 2 separate difficult histories. The ring on her right hand caught the firelight for a moment, the small diamond throwing a brief point of light across the wall. She thought about Thomas Gentry, honest and kind, who had ridden out in a lightning storm and not come back, who lay under the cottonwood at the field edge, who had been the first chapter of her adult life, and whom she carried with her still in a place that Matthew had never asked her to clear out or diminish. She thought about the morning she had sold the ring, and the strange man in the corner, and the $80, and the way he had walked out of the auction house before she could ask his name. She thought about finding him 2 weeks later on the sidewalk outside Mercer's, and learning his name and learning that he had known Thomas, briefly, that they had sat across a card table twice, and that Thomas had talked about his farm and his wife. She thought about the fence posts and the walk to the restaurant and the Sunday afternoons and the March wedding and the spring planting and the births and the seasons and all of it, every ordinary and extraordinary piece of a life that had been assembled out of loss and stubbornness and an auctioneer's gavel and a stranger's inexplicable generosity. "Matthew," she said. "Annie," he said. She smiled. He smiled. The fire crackled. Thomas looked up from his observation of Clara and said, "Mama," for no particular reason except that he felt like it. And Clara, as if in response, made the small specific noise she made when she was about to inform everyone within range that she required something. And Bess the dog's tail thumped against the floor, and Matthew stood up to take Clara from her basket before the full announcement began, and the house was full of noise and warmth and light. Outside, the Kansas night stretched clear and cold, the stars overhead in their vast, uncountable arrangements, the plains dark and wide and ancient beneath them. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. The fields were resting under the October dark. The cottonwood at the Gentry claim stood bare-branched in the cold, a marker and a witness, as it had been and as it would be. And inside the house on the rise with the east-facing window, Annie Hadley sat by the fire with her husband and her children and her good dog, and the particular kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of enough. And she thought that this was what she had been building toward through all of it, through the grief, and the scarcity and the auction house, and the slow, careful weeks of learning a man and being learned by him. She had not planned for Matthew Hadley. She had been in the middle of planning for everything else, for the mortgage and the winter and the question of how to make the farm work with one pair of hands, when the universe had placed a stranger in the corner of an auction house and handed him enough money and enough generosity to change the direction of everything. She was glad he had not introduced himself that day. She was glad he had walked out and stood in the street and then come back 2 weeks later on the sidewalk, because by then she was already a little more herself again, and a little less the woman with the ring and a square of cloth in her pocket, and she had been able to meet him more nearly as an equal, which was the only way she had ever been willing to meet anyone. She was glad about all of it, the hard parts and the good parts. The auction and the $80 and the fence posts and the March wedding and the 2 children asleep now. Thomas in his small bed and Clara in Matthew's arms, settling toward sleep with the great reluctant dignity of a person who does not want to stop being awake, but cannot quite prevent it. Matthew sat back down beside her with Clara settled against his chest, and Annie leaned her head on his shoulder, and he pressed his lips briefly to her hair, and outside the stars did their ancient, indifferent, beautiful work, and inside the house on the Kansas plains the Hadley family was home and warm and whole. That was enough. That was everything. That was, in the end, all any of it had ever been about. The building of this, the keeping of it, the daily choosing of it, the tremendous ordinary miracle of 2 people deciding, in a cold October street with the auction dust still in the air, that the other one was worth finding out about. Annie closed her eyes and listened to the fire and the breathing of her husband and the small night sounds of her sleeping children and the vast quiet of the Kansas night beyond the walls, and she let herself, fully and without reservation, be exactly where she was, whole, home, here. And the stars turned overhead as they had always turned, as they would always turn, above the wide dark plains where she had made her life, and where, God willing, she would spend all the rest of her days building it further, season by season, year by year, in the company of the silent man from the corner who had paid twice the worth of everything she had lost, and had in the end given it all back, and more.